1-1. Happy doing so much damage on the outskirts. And, oh, incredible display of skill from G2.
And G2 looking phenomenal. An almost indestructible team in this tournament.
Stewie versus Kenny. They shut down G2 almost flawlessly.
Nico has left FaZe Clan and joined G2.
Finds it to perfection. And Simple sitting. No! Disaster! An absolute disaster!
G2 do the unthinkable. The guillotine in Paris drops on the head of the king who will never touch the crown. Down goes G2 and forward go Fnatic.
G2 is one of the biggest and most prestigious esports organizations in the entire world. They boast top teams in games such as Fortnite, iRacing, Hearthstone, League of Legends, Valorant. I don't know what these fake ass games are, bro. Valorant. But most importantly, the only real game on this planet, Counter-Strike 2. Now, G2 has an incredibly interesting history throughout Counter-Strike. They somehow always find themselves to be one of the best teams in the world, but never really good enough to conquer the Counter-Strike world. But before we get into all of that, we need to go way back. After being a fairly successful World of Warcraft player reaching BlizzCon 2009 3-on-3 finals, Carlos Ocelot Rodriguez Santiago started playing one of those fake games I mentioned earlier, League of Legends. Well, Ocelot would become so cracked at this game, he'd become a professional player in 2010 for Demigio Club, before then moving over to SK Gaming. After a few years of mixed results, he'd end up leaving in December 2013 and compete in the Scan EUW Winter Invitational for Team LOL, where they lost against C9 EU in the finals. Then just a few months later, on the 24th of February 2014, Ocelot would be sick of these other organizations and go on to create his own. It would be called Gamers 2. Originally, this was only an organization for League, where Ocelot would go on to sign himself as a player. It's truly a genius move if you ask me. Buddy was a player and the GM, so he just has zero stress about getting benched. But unfortunately, this is not a good strategy for success, because with him in the team, they were not very good. So in early 2015, he'd step down and just focus on the org. He also became the team's coach for a little bit, but this didn't last too long. Then on the 15th of October 2015, Gamers 2 would rebrand to G2, and around the same time is when the organization would enter Counter-Strike Global Offensive. Ocelot would bring G2 in at Counter-Strike, trying to prove a point. During this time, the scene was completely dominated by teams like TSM, Fnatic, VP, and Envy, all teams that were 100% national, but Ocelot thought that maybe he could change that. International teams worked in League just fine. He had played on multiple of them, so why couldn't they work in Counter-Strike? To him, it seemed like the scene was overlooking the possibility of international rosters, but he wouldn't. So on September 11th, 2015, G2 would purchase the Kinguin roster, which was regarded as the first ever international super team. They did technically join a little bit earlier as Gamers 2. They picked up a Polar Squad ESC Gaming, but the team wasn't very good. They didn't last very long. I'm gonna skip over it. The deal barely went through because the team got banned for match fixing accusations, then it got reversed by Valve. It's just a listen. They had a tier 7 Polish team for a little bit, and then they didn't. This G2 team would include Michael Lele, Rain, Dennis, Fox, and Scream. 2 Swedes, a Norwegian, a Belgian, and a tatted up Portuguese man. The last 2 events this Kinguin roster played before transferring over to the G2 org was ESL 1 Cologne Major, where they placed top 8, and Gaming Paradise, which they won. They were looking to be on the up and up, but the transfer over to G2 didn't come without a few issues. Maybe the most important player on this entire team was Scream. Even without having really any notable achievements, due to his playstyle alone, this guy was already Counter-Strike royalty, and unfortunately, he would simply play one tournament with G2, DreamHack Open London 2015, before requesting to return to Titan, the French team he had played on in 2014. It had been one whole tournament before the team fell apart, which is honestly the perfect way to start up this organization's history in Counter-Strike. So with Scream gone, the team would need a replacement, and they'd end up going with young rifler Jacob. At this point, the next major was only about a month away, so he would need to be integrated incredibly quickly. Fortunately for G2, it isn't that hard to integrate a player when you can just run around and headshot everyone, which is exactly what this team did best. At the next major, DreamHack Open Cluj-Napoca 2015, G2 would be placed in a group with TSM, Mouse Sports, and Flipside Tactics, the number 1, number 13, and number 14 best teams in the world. And with how this format worked, only 2 of these teams would make it to the playoffs. And with TSM basically being a shoo-in, they would need to fight for that second spot. And fight they did, as they would cook Mouse 16-8 in the first game, and then play TSM in the 1-0 game, where they did get fried. But it was fine because they would get to rematch against Mouse in the 1-1 game. The winner would make playoffs and the loser would go home. Except this time, instead of it being a BO1, it would be a BO3. And this time, Mouse actually came to play. The first map of Mirage would go to OT, where the boys would just nearly squeak out a win. But then Mouse would bounce back and win map 2 16-12. And now it would all come down to a cash map 3, where G2 would easily win. And the team's newest player, Jacob, would be one of the main reasons they won this series, as he would post a 1.32 rating and push G2 into their first ever playoffs. Jacob's addition to this team was absolutely not a scam, which unfortunately cannot be said for anyone who was recently traded with him. And sadly for G2, the first game they'd have to play in the playoffs would be against Virtus Pro, the 3rd best team in the world. This quarterfinals matchup was incredibly tough, as VP had made the semifinals of the last 3 majors in a row. G2 would have to play out of their goddamn minds if they wanted to have any chance here. And well, one man took up the offer. It was once again the new addition, Jacob, who posted a 1.49 to completely sun VP. This international project had already taken out one of the big 4 national rosters. And while less international than they were when they first started, Jacob was Norwegian, similar to Rain. They were still proving that these types of rosters did have a place in Counter-Strike. And now in the semifinals, the next giant they'd have to face would be French team Envy. And they'd start out incredibly hot, winning the first map 16-10. Another Jacob masterclass, and this time he was even helped out by Dennis. Then map 2 would come down to the final round. Envy were up 15-14, but had no money. And G2 would easily push us into overtime. And this overtime was absolutely despicable. Envy wins the first round convincingly, but then the next round G2 runs a B split and they win convincingly. The next round comes down to a 3v3 post plant on B, a post plant that Envy would win. Then G2 easily wins the first CT round, then Envy, then G2. We just keep going back and forth until we need double overtime. And here's how the first round of double OT went.
The win on this map is incredibly important for Envy to take it to the decider. Can they do it?
Envy presumably looking for a pop flash peek here to try and force Fox off the angle. He's going to get the kill regardless. He is in it for the spinach stand. He's got Jacob behind the smoke now. Another 2-man spray down for him. They just cannot take the B bomb site here. Another frag for Fox. There's only 8 bits left. He's soon to fall as well.
G2 would then go on to win the next 2 CT rounds. It was a flawless half, and they were up 21-18. All they needed was a single round, and they were in the major finals. But then this is where the curse of G2 would officially begin.
The auto sniper, there's kill number 1. MBK's not going to stop. The flames come in as well. How on earth are they going to push the site? It's not happening.
Information, the smoke's coming through, but we've got Fox. He's on the truck here. Apex is about spotting him, but he can't get the frag. Dennis will get taken down on the site though. Makalele going down on short as well. Fox will be soon to follow.
They're going for the push right now. Can Envious defend here to keep themselves alive? Will the chance to be kept alive? Yes! We got MBK with a couple frags there with the help of Happy, but we got Trace straight back in there. There is still hope here for G2 to close this one down and kick Envious out of the tournament. Here it is, the after-plant situation.
But again, they're on the wrong side of the smoke. Heavily tagged, Makalele falls to the flames. Dennis doesn't have enough to do it.
As they would go on to completely crumble, losing the next 7 rounds in a row. Then after that, map 3 wasn't even close. Envy would go on to beat G2, then beat Na'Vi in the finals and win the whole goddamn thing. As you might expect, the players on the team were completely heartbroken, and Makalele would go on to say, "It's still haunting me sometimes. I think that was my best shot at winning a major. I don't want to take anything away from Na'Vi, but I think we would have crushed them in the final. I think our playstyle matched up well against theirs, with Fox agreeing and saying we were 90% sure that we would win. Maybe the team was too locked into thinking about that major final when they were up 21-18, because I don't know how else you can just completely crumble in that fashion. As tragic as this run was, G2 still made the semifinals of a major. This was great at proving the organization was here to stay and that the team could absolutely compete at the highest level even though they were international. But unfortunately, the team would never really recover from this choke. 11 days later, the team's IGL Dennis would be sold to Fnatic, and to replace him would be a Danish player, AZ. The team would finish top 4 at Intel Extreme Masters X San Jose, but cracks began to form incredibly quickly. See, the issue was AZ was a rifler lurker who was replacing an IGL. The move just made no sense, and the team would go on to become incredibly sloppy. Probably the biggest voice in the team, Michaelele, suggested that they bring in Exist, his former teammate, but this didn't end up happening, and to be honest, there were bigger issues at hand. The relationship between the players in G2 was getting worse by the day. We don't know exactly why, but it was supposedly because of alleged unpaid prize winnings, and it only got worse when the players on G2 began to flirt with the idea of joining FaZe, a new esports giant that was looking to enter the scene. And while at first it was just talks, this actually would end up materializing, and G2 would sell their roster to FaZe Clan for around $700,000. Now, this move wasn't as clean as I'm making it seem. There were a couple tampering issues where FaZe nearly ended up getting the team for free, which was a complete breach of contract, and Michaelele nearly got banned from every large tournament organizer in Counter-Strike. And apparently during this time, tensions got so bad, someone threw shoes at Ocelot. But with all of this messiness, listen, at the end of the day, a deal did go through. FaZe Clan now owned this old Team Kinguin roster. This Kinguin team that G2 had bought out, who looked like they had unlimited potential, just made semifinals of a major, would only end up being with the organization for around 4 months. The team was picked up on September 11th, 2015, and was sold to FaZe Clan on January 20th, 2016. So I sure hope you weren't attached to those players, because FaZe Clan sure weren't. This move would go on to pretty much end nearly all of these players' careers, because FaZe did not know what they were doing in Counter-Strike. Michaelele would be benched a couple months after this move happened. Then Fox would be benched in August, Jacob would be benched in November, and then in early 2017, AZ would be sold to North. So around a year after signing with FaZe Clan, this Team Kinguin roster was completely dead, and only Rain, who still is on the team today, would remain. February 1st, 2016. A little over a week since G2 had sold their roster to FaZe Clan, they would finally sign a new team. It would be the roster of Titan. This team was majority French, with Shocks, RPK, and Smiths, and then 2 Belgian players, Existence and Scream. Welcome back, buddy. Oh yeah, also, yeah, G2 was saying fuck it. They didn't want an international roster anymore. It was too much work, okay? Ocelot came in, proved his point they can be good, and he had enough. Anyways, this new G2 team would go on to be fine. They wouldn't really have the same peaks that the old Kinguin roster did, but they placed 9th to 12th at MLG Major Columbus, which means they just barely missed out on playoffs. Then on April 9th, 2016, they'd replace Existence with a French caller named Body. The team would go on to win Esports Championship Series Season 1 Finals, but come in last place at the next major, ESL 1 Cologne 2016. Now, 2016 wasn't a complete failure for G2. Yes, not a lot of major success, but they did win a tournament, and 2 of their players would make the HLTV top 20 list. But besides that one tournament win, they didn't do much of anything else for the rest of 2016. In 2017, major formats would be slightly different. It was switched to one big group, and if you lose 3 games, you're out. Win 3 games, you're in. Well, after coming in 12th to 14th place and bombing out 1-3 at E-League Major Atlanta 2017, G2 decided they were tired of being mediocre and made a huge change. RPK and the 9th best player of last year, Scream, were out. And along with that, Smiths would become the team's coach. Then to replace those 3 players would be the core of Team Envious. NBK, Apex, and Kenny S. Yes, Team Envious, the team that had just ruined G2's life at a major a little over a year ago. That core would join up with Shox and Body, who were the last remaining pieces of the old G2 roster. Hey man, you know what they say, it's that old classic line, if a team fucks you, buy their core out and hold them hostage under your organization. But the team would look better almost immediately, winning DreamHack Open Tours 2017 and ESL Pro League Season 5 Finals. But then, at the second major of 2017, PGL Major Krakow, they didn't do much better than the previous G2 team. For the rest of 2017, not much happened. They won DreamHack Masters Malmo 2017, and Kenny S was the 7th best player of the year, but that was pretty much it. Heading into 2018, the French G2 were kind of trapped. They were in the state of being very good, easily a top 10 team, but not really elite. Sure, they'd win a tournament here and there, but the main goal of any Counter-Strike team is to win a major, and it wasn't really looking like this G2 team was strong enough to do that. But they'd get their next chance at E-League Major Boston 2018. And unlike the past few majors, G2 would actually come out swinging. They'd beat Cloud9 16-8, then Liquid 16-8, then Quantum Bellator Fire 16-4. They had just made playoffs in a dominant 3-0 fashion. And it would be the organization's first major playoffs since all that time ago in 2015. But unfortunately for G2, the organization's major curse was simply stronger than the players' willpower. The NV core would throw the game and be the 3 lowest rated players in a blowout to Cloud9, the team that they had just stomped in the group stage. And that Cloud9 team would then go on to win the entire thing. At this point, teams who beat G2 in major playoffs have a 100% major win rate, so it seems that's really all you have to do. The curse would make G2 choke, then give the team that beats them supernatural powers to run over everyone else in the playoffs. And this time, similar to the last time G2 lost in the playoffs, the roster would just begin to crumble. On March 9th, Mixwell would go on to replace Shox on trial, and their former player and now coach Smiths would also step down as he wanted to return to playing. Their manager would then take over as coach for the time being, then Smiths and Shox would be moved to the bench. The Mixwell experiment only lasted a few months, as in May he would be allowed to explore options. Then in June, NBK and Apex would both be benched. This meant the team now had 2 players, Kenny S and Body. So in order to field a starting lineup, Shox and Smiths would be thrown back into the starting roster, along with the team's old in-game leader as a stand-in. Then on October 8th, 2018, Vitality would join the Counter-Strike scene, a dark time for us all, and by NBK and Apex from G2's bench. Then in November of 2018, G2 would try and field a serious team again, not filled with bench players and stand-ins, as they would get Lucky and Jax from 3D Max to replace Smiths, their former coach, and Existence, their stand-in. Shox would then become the team's in-game leader, and Malik would become the team's coach. Now, as you might expect, due to the complete mess that G2 was this year, they would do a whole lot of nothing, and also, as you might expect, not a single player from the team would make the top 20 this year. While not as messy as 2018 was, 2019 was sadly looking to be more of the same for G2. After going 1-3 in the Legend stage of IEM Katowice Major, the team would finally make another change. Body was out, and French rifler Amanek was in. They'd roll with this team until the Starladder Berlin Major later in 2019. Up to this point, the team looked incredibly mediocre, but this major would completely change the trajectory of the organization moving forward. G2 would go 2-3 in Legend stage, once again missing out on major playoffs. 9 majors attended and only 2 playoffs made. This is not what Ocelot had envisioned going into this game. So it was time to go in a new direction. And honestly, the timing couldn't have been better. There was a new tier 2 team on the rise, and their name was Crazy. A young international lineup that blew through the challenger stage at 3-1. This was mostly due to the team's star IGL and rifler duo, Nexa and Hunter. In this challenger stage, the team's IGL Nexa posted a 1.27, which was the 6th highest rating in this stage. And right behind him would be Hunter with a 1.23. They were absolutely farming, and now they get to do it in the Legend stage. Unfortunately, their first match would be against Prime 2019 Liquid, so of course they'd lose, but they would win their next 2 games against legendary organizations NIP and FaZe. The team was 2-1 and only needed to win 1 more match to make the playoffs. But unfortunately, in their 2-1 game, they would have to play Astralis. And yes, this was an Astralis in the middle of their era. Now, as you might expect, the team would lose 1-2, but I feel like this is the series that really opened up everyone's eyes to see the players on this team's potential. Astralis would have to sweat to win this series, winning map 1 but losing map 2 in a crazy 5 overtime match, and then closing it out on map 3. Then in the 2-2 match, they would get another brutal draw, having to play Na'Vi and Simple. Once again, they would take a map but lose 1-2. While they did miss out on playoffs, this incredibly impressive showing was enough to get the attention of Ocelot. G2 had been mediocre for so long, and the most success they ever had was when they were international. So why not start to transition back? After this major, G2 would part ways with Shox, bench Lucky, and then sign the 2 star players from Crazy, Nexa and Hunter. The team still had a core of French players, but it was clear what the organization's future intentions were. COVID time is normally a period I like to skip through very quickly. Online CS just didn't do it for me, but we kind of have to talk about it for G2's story. At the end of 2019, this new G2 roster won a tier 2 tournament against Team Spirit, which is great, but something the old roster probably could have also done. But we'd really get to see the team's potential at the last LAN of 2020, Intel Extreme Masters World Championship. They'd actually make the finals of this, beating out teams like 100 Thieves, Mouse Sports, Team Liquid, and Fnatic. Very impressive results, but Nexa and Hunter would once again get knocked out by Simple and Na'Vi in the finals. Then throughout 2020, not really much else happened. Sure, a finals appearance here and there, but no tournaments were won. Then on October 28th, 2020, G2 would make their biggest signing in the organization's history. They would land one of the greatest riflers in all of Counter-Strike, Nico. You might be wondering to yourself, where the fuck did this come from? Well, Nico is the player who replaced AZ, the last player to leave from that initial Kingwin roster that G2 sold to FaZe. And he was a demon on his time with the team, but after tragically losing to Cloud9 in the Boston finals, FaZe clan kinda started to crumble, and that would eventually lead to Kerrigan being benched. Then FaZe would just bounce players in and out of the roster throughout most of 2019. They didn't have much success, and throughout most of 2020, this continued. So eventually, Nico was sick of the instability, and he wanted to leave. But why G2, you might be asking? Well, there's one thing that I didn't mention about G2's new addition, Hunter. Not only was he a superstar rifler for Crazy, he was also the cousin of Nico, which absolutely helped in convincing him to join this team. These two cousins would immediately be one of the most interesting storylines in all of Counter-Strike, and for the first time since January 2016, G2 would not be predominantly French. Originally, the man Nico would replace would be Jax, but in March of 2021, Jax would be brought back to the starting roster and legendary AWPer Kenny S would be benched. Since Nico had joined, Kenny was not playing well, only posting a 0.98 rating, so G2 decided it was finally time. But now, as you may have noticed, G2 does not have an AWPer. And originally it was decided that Nico would take up the AWPing duties. Dear God, but this would not last very long, and it was instead given over to Amanek. G2 would end the online era, not having won a tournament, but were considered a solid top 10 team. The first LAN in nearly 2 years would be IEM Cologne, and G2 would make it all the way to the finals of this, where they would lose to Simple and Na'Vi, a bit of a recurring theme. Then after this, the team would have to look forward to PGL Major Stockholm 2021. Not having a true AWPer at this major would be tough, but with Nico playing at absolute peak form, G2 glided through groups going 3-0. Nico would post a 1.38 and Hunter a 1.26. The Bosnian cousins had just powered G2 into their third ever playoffs, and this time they were gonna make it further than ever before. They'd easily beat NIP in the quarters, play an incredibly close series against Heroic in the semis, where they'd win and make their first ever major finals. And in these finals, they'd have to play Simple and Na'Vi. God fucking damn it. Either Nico or Simple would get their first major trophy, and unfortunately for G2, Na'Vi would take map 1. Then in map 2, we would get one of the most tragic clips in Counter-Strike history.
Simple to save them. Drive by onto Nexa, 2 frags away from G2 extending play. Hunter and Nico, how poetic. And it's Simple and Bit times it to perfection. And Simple sitting. No! Disaster! An absolute disaster!
G2 would then go on to lose Nuke in double overtime to miss out on yet another major win. Was this the Nico curse, or was it the G2 curse at this point? This was the second time it seemed like a major title was in their grasp, and it was heartbreakingly choked away. Shortly after this, they part ways with their coach, and Swanee would step in as the interim coach. While the individuals on G2 were incredibly exciting, Nico was the third best player of 2021 and Hunter the 12th. They close out 2021 with no tournament wins. In fact, G2 hadn't won a tier 1 tournament since 2017 at this point. It seemed like they still needed more pieces, so at the start of 2022, the organization would take its biggest risk since they joined the scene. In January, G2 completely overhauled its entire team. They'd signed 16-year-old prodigy opera m0NESY from Na'Vi Academy for a reported $600,000. Only $100,000 less than what they sold their entire team for a few years prior. Now, this was of course a huge risk, as m0NESY had not proven himself at all in Tier 1, but it was a risk the team was willing to take. And of course, the one to make way for m0NESY would be Amanek. They would then take another risk a few weeks later, as they do an IGL swap with OG. Nexa would be sent away, and G2 would get Alexi B. Alexi had been the captain of a Tier 2 ENCE team a few years ago, kinda similar to Nexa where he had a good major run, except Alexi made it all the way to a major finals. Since then, he had been kicked from ENCE, given the keys to OG, and didn't really end up having success. G2 are banking on the fact that Alexi still had that dog in him. They would then also sign Xtaz as their coach, who was just the previous coach of Vitality. Then the icing on the cake, Nico and Hunter would sign multi-year contracts with the organization. After all of these moves, two things would become clear incredibly quickly. m0NESY was fucking unbelievable and absolutely worth every single penny, as he had a 1.13 in the first 6 months with the team, and on the other hand, it seemed like Alexi no longer had that dog in him. They would make the finals of Intel Extreme Masters, Katowice, but wouldn't make another finals with Alexi as their captain, and would end up missing the playoffs of PGL Major Antwerp 2022. Somehow, some way, it seemed like G2 had taken a step back. And because of this, only 6 months after joining the team, Alexi B would be sent away to NIP jail. Then to replace him would be another IGL who impressed on a Tier 2 team, HooXi. He had just led Copenhagen Flames to the playoffs of the major G2 just missed out on. Then after this, G2 would also go on to replace the last remaining Frenchman in the team, Jax, with Australian star rifler JKS. With HooXi and JKS, this team would make the semi-finals of Blast Premier Spring Finals and ESL Pro League Season 16. Then when it came time to play in the qualifier for the next major, the Rio Major EU RMR, they completely bombed out, only winning one match and going 1-3. How the fuck does this keep happening? This team would somehow look solid at every Tier 1 tournament they attended, then completely shit themselves when it came to majors. After this, G2 would release their coach Xtaz. Ah yes, maybe a coach change can relieve G2 of this curse. But then on November 1st, 2022, Pekka would take over as the G2 general manager. And as we know today, he is one of the most controversial GMs in all of Counter-Strike. But with all this bad news, there was some light at the end of the tunnel. As in the last tournament of the year, Blast Premier World Final, G2 would not only make finals, but win the entire thing. Their first Tier 1 tournament since 2017. Not only this, but G2 would have 3 players in the top 20 this year. Nico at 5, m0NESY at 7, and Hunter at 14. For the first time in years, G2's future was looking incredibly bright. G2 had finally arrived, baby. On paper, this roster was completely stacked. Nico, Hunter, JKS, m0NESY, and HooXi, with their recent success, would start 2023 as the number 3 ranked team in the world. G2 would then play IEM Katowice 2023, where they once again won. After a 5-year drought, G2 had just won back-to-back Tier 1 lands. Strangely though, at the next Tier 1 tournament, ESL Pro League Season 17, they'd bomb out in 9th to 12th place. But it was all good. They'd have a little over a month to prepare for the next major. Surely that was enough time to fix their mistakes. But this wasn't just any major. This would be the last major in CSGO history.
Triple kill out of Monsieur Elbow, and now
CS2 was right around the corner at this point, and this would be G2's last chance to be crowned in Counter-Strike Global Offensive. They make it out of the RMR, thank God, and even cruise through the first stage 3-0. Now, all they would have to do is win 3 more series to make playoffs. They'd win 1. this powerhouse roster would somehow miss playoffs again. The only organization who could make winning look this hard with this good of players on paper was G2. Once again this year, they would have 3 players in the top 20. Nico at 2, m0NESY at 4, and Hunter at 13. Every single one improved their placement. And yet this goddamn team still can't do anything in majors. I don't get it. Like, how is this core not even close to making the playoffs? Despite being one of the giants in the scene, G2 at NCSGO only having made 3 major playoffs, despite attending 12. And if you include the Rio RMR failure, that makes it 13. 13 majors they attempted to make it to, 3 playoffs made. I just don't get it. A few months after this unbelievable disaster, G2 would go on to win IEM Cologne 2023, and then shortly after, we'd switch over to CS2. The first tournament in CS2 would be IEM Sydney 2023. And with all the chaos of hopping over to a new game, G2 would still look incredibly solid, making the semifinals of this tournament. But something incredibly strange would happen directly after this. JKS, who had been a strong rifler and anchor for the team, would be benched and replaced with the team's old IGL, Nexa. What the fuck? It wasn't a coincidence this team magically started winning tournaments after JKS joined this team, and now he was being benched. For why? The reasoning we would initially get is apparently there were too many star roles in the team, and Nexa would require less space and do more for the team. This was the first of many incredibly strange moves GM Pekka would make, and he wasn't done. Just a few weeks later, Taz would be brought in for Swanee. He was a legend of the game, sure, being a major winner and on that Virtus Plow roster, but that didn't mean he knew how to be a coach. And when he was playing, he was never really looked at as being a tactical mind of the game, so I guess he was just there for motivational support. Anyways, G2 would close out 2023 with no notable results, and we'd have to see how these 2 roster moves fared heading into 2024. The start of the year was meh for G2. 2 tier 1 tournaments and 2 5th to 6th place finishes, but none of that would really matter if they could do something at the Copenhagen Major, the first major of CS2. Thankfully, the team would have a direct invite to the stage right before playoffs, except this major was looking to be just like all of the other ones. They'd start off 1-2 with losses to Na'Vi and Cloud9, but thankfully for them, in their other 2 matches, they'd get Ecstatic and VP. Neither one of these teams had even close to the quality of players G2 had, but even with that, both of these games would be incredibly sweaty, going all 3 maps in both. But with player quality alone, G2 would squeak into their 4th ever major playoffs. The good news doesn't stop there though. The 2 favorites to win the event, Spirit and FaZe, were on the complete opposite side of the bracket, and they were playing each other in the first match. G2's side of the bracket included Eternal Fire, Na'Vi, and Mouse. They could easily reach the finals if they just played up to their potential. They'd take on Mouse in the quarters, easily winning 2-0. There were some distractions that happened during this game that affected Mouse's mental, but we don't really need to get into that. And then in the semis, they'd play Na'Vi. But this Na'Vi was nothing like the team G2 had lost to in Stockholm. This was a random international roster with JL, Ima, Bit, Wonderful, and G2's old IGL they sent off to NIP jail, Alexi B. The teams would trade maps, and we'd go into a third on Ancient. This was one of the best maps of the entire event. But when it was all said and done, Alexi B would get his revenge on G2 and go to his 2nd ever major finals, while m0NESY's 1.46 rating just wasn't enough to push G2 over the edge. This team just cannot beat Na'Vi, man. It's crazy. But even with losing in the semifinals and the questionable roster moves, G2 would have their best major result since 2021. Between now and the next major, Perfect World Shanghai, G2 would go on to win 3 tier 1 tournaments. The first of which was with Stewie2K as a stand-in for Hooksy. This IEM Dallas run would be one of the most legendary tournament runs of all time, but also propelled G2 into various roster changes. After m0NESY, Nico, and Hunter had to hard carry Nexa event after event, he would finally be benched and replaced with M80 star rifler Malbs MD. And along with Nexa, winning this tournament would also doom Hooksy. After winning with a washed and a rifler and Nico IGLing, it seemed that maybe Hooksy was holding the team back. Now, there were talks of if Nico would just take over IGLing duties to replace him. I mean, throughout his career, he was a strong secondary caller and just IGL G2 into a tournament win. But instead of this, Pekka would pick up another old player from the Virtus Plow days. Snacks. He would become G2's new IGL. These moves seemed like firepower upgrades on paper, and well, Malbs absolutely was. His addition plus Nico, Monesi, and Hunter made G2 on paper the most talented team in the world. And Snacks would be serviceable as a caller, but wouldn't really be a firepower upgrade like everyone thought. But despite that, after these changes is when G2 would go on to win their next 2 tournaments, Blast Premier Fall Final and Blast Premier World Final. Then we were off to the Shanghai Major. Except a few things to note here. G2 going into this were the best team in the world and easily favored to win the whole thing. But as soon as things were finally looking up, once again, disaster would strike. G2 would go into this major as a dead team, as it was leaked prior that their star rifler Nico, and maybe most important player over the past 4 years, was leaving and would be joining Falcons. And this was set to happen directly after this major ended. Maybe the best G2 roster ever assembled would be lasting less than 6 months, but despite all of this, would have one last chance to reach the pinnacle of Counter-Strike greatness. If G2 didn't win this one, they probably weren't going to win one for a very long time. It would start out very well as they would breeze through the groups 3-1 and make playoffs extremely easily. Their first match in the playoffs would be a surprise team, Heroic. They were absolutely not favored to make the playoffs, but they were kind of a dark horse. So if G2 wanted to win, they'd have to play their A game. And as a tale as old as time, G2 would look incredibly shaky and lose map 1 13-6. Since G2's inception, it seemed like they were cursed to never win a major, but they weren't out of it just yet. They'd win map 2 on Nuke and head to a third. Mirage would end up being as close as it can possibly get, a 6-6 half followed by another 6-6 half, and we're in overtime. G2 would take the lead 14-13 and then lock it on their CT side to win 16-13. They had barely survived to make their second semifinals in a row, and here they'd have to play FaZe Clan, the team they sold their international roster to all those years ago. And kind of similar to Heroic, FaZe absolutely should not have been here. They've looked terrible the past few months, terrible in the group stage of this major, and yet they locked in just enough to make it here. They would then continue to lock in and crush G2 2-0. Another semifinals exit, and maybe G2's best ever chance at a major title gone. Not only that, the future was looking extremely bleak. This leads us to 2025 and where we are today. Without Nico, G2 fell off a cliff. His replacement would be Heavy God, and they tried to fit Malbs into Nico's old roles, but this just wasn't enough. Eventually, after a few middling results, it was then leaked that Monesi 2 would be leaving for Falcons. The best duo in G2's history was now gone, and to replace Monesi would be Hades on loan. G2 would play with this roster at the Austin Major, where they would miss playoffs, going 2-3. After this, Sunpius would replace Hades, and Saw would replace Taz, with Snacks also being benched in July, and Matties from Fnatic being his replacement. Then Hunter, the longest tenured player on the team, would take over the role of IGL, and that's the roster G2 is left with today. Throughout G2's history, they've been one of the Counter-Strike giants, a huge organization who many would be honored to play for, but despite being one of these behemoths of the scene, they somehow always found a way to come up short at majors. While they are one of Counter-Strike's best, they're also one of Counter-Strike's most underwhelming. Thank you for watching.